I knew the HOA was out for blood when I saw the tow truck idling at the edge of my driveway. The driver sat there, engine rumbling, eyes locked on my property like a vulture waiting for its meal to stop twitching. My stomach twisted. I hadn't called for a tow. No one I knew had. And yet, there it was, right alongside a smug-looking HOA rep clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. I stepped outside, heart hammering, and that's when I saw it, the bright orange violation notice slapped onto car. Excessive vehicles on property. Immediate removal required. The words were printed in bold, accusing letters, as if my driveway was some kind of junkyard. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but the look on the HOA rep's face killed any amusement before it could form. She stood with her arms crossed, lips pursed in a smug little line, waiting for me to react. I didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I took my time, peeling the notice off with slow, deliberate fingers. "This is a mistake," I said, my voice calm despite the heat building in my chest. She tilted her chin up, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. "There's no mistake. HOA guidelines strictly limit residents to 3 vehicles. You have 6. I glanced at my driveway. My truck. My wife's SUV. My brother's car, he was visiting for the weekend. And yeah, 3 more vehicles, but they weren't cluttering up the street or blocking sidewalks. They were parked neatly on my own damn property." "That's funny," I said, crumpling the notice in my hand. "Because my deed says this land is mine. Pretty sure I can park as many cars as I want." The tow truck driver shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't on board for whatever power trip she was on, that much was obvious. But he wasn't the problem. She was. "The rules apply to everyone," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "If you don't remove the excess vehicles by tomorrow, they'll be towed at your expense." A slow burn ignited in my gut, but I kept my expression neutral. I knew HOAs. Knew their type. The power-hungry ones, the ones who wielded their little neighborhood regulations like a crown. I'd dealt with them before, and I sure as hell wasn't about to roll over for this one. I took a step forward, closing the distance just enough for her to see I wasn't intimidated. "And what happens," I asked, voice low and steady, "when you realize you can't tow property you don't own?" That threw her off. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she masked it with irritation. "You're in an HOA neighborhood," she snapped. "You agreed to these rules when you moved in." I chuckled. "See, that's where you're wrong." I reached into my back pocket, pulling out a neatly folded document. My property deed. One I had gone over 100 times before purchasing this land. One that I had confirmed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, stated something very, very important. I unfolded it, took my time straightening the edges. Then I turned it toward her and tapped the line that sealed her fate. "This property," I said, savoring the moment, "is not under HOA jurisdiction." Her smugness evaporated so fast, you'd think I had slapped her. She snatched the paper from my hand, eyes darting over the text, looking for some kind of loophole, some escape. But there was none. And I knew it. Because I didn't just own my house. I owned the whole damn neighborhood. The silence stretched, thick with tension. The tow truck driver coughed awkwardly. A few neighbors peeked out from their windows, sensing something brewing. She finally looked up, trying to salvage her authority. "There must be some mistake," she said, but her voice lacked confidence now. "No mistake," I said, taking back my deed. "I bought up the surrounding lots last year. The undeveloped properties, the ones the HOA assumed they controlled. Turns out, they don't. And that means your little vehicle rule? Your power plays? They don't apply to me." I stepped back onto my porch, leaning against the railing. "So go ahead. Try to tow my cars. But just know, by the time you file your little complaint, I'll have already filed a cease and desist against the HOA for harassment." Her face went pale. And just like that, the game had changed. The HOA rep stood frozen, her fingers tightening around the clipboard as she processed what I had just told her. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, trying to find a way around the reality that she had no authority here. The tow truck driver, sensing the tension, shifted in his seat and made the smart decision to drive off, his engine rumbling as he disappeared down the road. That left just her, standing in my driveway, her confidence unraveling by the second. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched away, but I knew this wasn't over. People like her never backed down that easily. Sure enough, the next morning, I found another envelope stuffed into my mailbox, this one thicker than the last. A formal notice of violation, along with a list of demands: remove the excess vehicles, bring my property into compliance, and attend a mandatory HOA hearing to discuss my repeated offenses. The arrogance of it was almost impressive. They were doubling down, pretending as if they still had the upper hand. I leaned against my truck, flipping through the pages, shaking my head at their audacity. They weren't just trying to enforce rules that didn't apply to me, they were actively trying to wear me down, hoping I would fold under pressure. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I pulled out every document, every deed, every legal record proving my ownership, ensuring that there was no possible way for them to claim jurisdiction over my land. I made copies, organized them neatly, and waited. If they wanted a battle, I was going to give them one. By the time I arrived at the so-called hearing that evening, the air inside the HOA's meeting hall was thick with tension. A long table sat at the front of the room, lined with board members who eyed me like I was a nuisance they couldn't wait to eliminate. Neighbors filled the chairs behind me, some whispering, some watching in silence. At the center of it all sat the HOA president, a gray-haired man with the kind of expression that said he had been in charge for far too long and enjoyed every second of it. He cleared his throat and gestured for me to take a seat at the front. The next 30 minutes were a carefully orchestrated ambush. They recited rule after rule, pulling out binders full of regulations, throwing around fines and penalties as if their words alone had the power to make them real. They spoke in that condescending, bureaucratic tone, the kind that assumed everyone else was too dumb or too scared to challenge them. I let them talk, let them dig themselves deeper, nodding along as if I were actually considering their nonsense. Then, when they had finished, I placed my folder on the table, flipped it open, and laid out the undeniable truth. My property had never been under HOA control. The land had been purchased privately, separate from the development, exempt from any of their rules. The vehicles they were so concerned about? Parked on my land, not theirs. The violations they had issued? Baseless. The fines? Legally unenforceable. I watched the color drain from their faces as I walked them through the legal framework, every fact backed by official documents, every attempt to challenge me crushed before it could gain momentum. By the time I was done, the room had fallen into a stunned silence. The HOA president clenched his jaw, shuffling through his papers as if looking for something, anything, that could dispute what I had just laid out. But there was nothing. One of the board members, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, tried to regain control by claiming that, regardless of technicalities, I still had an obligation to respect the community standards. That was my breaking point. I leaned forward, my voice steady but firm, and reminded them all that respect was a two-way street, and they had done nothing but harass and threaten me over rules that didn't apply. They had wasted my time, sent baseless fines, and even attempted to tow vehicles they had no right to touch. I could see the shift in the room. Some of the neighbors, who had remained quiet before, now exchanged glances, clearly realizing that this wasn't just about me, it was about an HOA that had been overstepping its bounds for far too long. I knew then that I had won the legal battle, but this was far from over. People like this didn't accept defeat easily. As I walked out of the hall, feeling the weight of their glares on my back, I had no doubt that they would try again. And the next time, they wouldn't just come for my cars. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to something worse than another violation notice: retaliation. It started subtly, almost calculated in its pettiness. My trash bins, which I had placed neatly by the curb the night before, had been knocked over, garbage strewn across my driveway like a wild animal had ripped through it. Except I knew better. There were no raccoons in this area, no stray dogs that could have done this. Someone had come in the dead of night, tipped them over, and left without a trace. I cleaned up the mess, ignoring the growing suspicion in my gut, and moved on with my day. But by the evening, another nuisance appeared, this time, in the form of an official letter from the city, informing me that multiple complaints had been lodged against my property for excessive noise and disruptions. I frowned at the absurdity of it. I lived on the edge of the development, my house sitting on a large plot of land, separated from most of my neighbors. The only sounds that ever came from my property were the occasional hum of power tools when I worked on my truck or the distant murmur of a radio playing in my garage. There had been no parties, no loud music blaring late at night, nothing that could possibly justify a noise complaint. And yet, someone, no, not someone, the HOA, had gone out of their way to fabricate an issue, dragging city officials into their personal vendetta. By the time I received the third letter, this one warning me about unauthorized modifications to my home, I knew exactly what was happening. They couldn't beat me legally, so they were trying to drown me in bureaucracy, weaponizing every possible loophole, every minor code violation they could dig up. The message was clear: if I didn't play by their rules, they would make my life miserable. They were counting on exhaustion, hoping I would give up and submit just to make it stop. But they had underestimated just how much I thrived in situations like this. Instead of reacting, I went on the offensive. I spent the next 2 days documenting everything: the complaints, the letters, the incidents of vandalism. I installed security cameras around my property, covering every angle, ensuring that the next time someone tried to pull something, I'd have proof. I reached out to the city's zoning office, requesting a full report on the supposed violations they had cited, and, as expected, there was nothing. The modifications they had accused me of were either non-existent or well within legal bounds. Then, I did what I knew would send a shockwave through the HOA. I filed a formal complaint against them. Not just a simple dispute over their baseless violations, but a full-scale harassment claim. I gathered every instance of their overreach, compiled the legal documents proving my exemption, and sent it straight to the county office. If they wanted to play dirty, I would play smarter. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. The first sign of their panic came when a different board member, one I had never spoken to before, showed up at my property, acting far more diplomatic than anyone had been in the past few weeks. He attempted to smooth things over, claiming that the recent issues had been misunderstandings, and that the HOA was simply trying to maintain neighborhood standards. His tone was carefully crafted, laced with just enough fake sincerity to make it seem like they were the victims in all of this. But I wasn't falling for it. I told him, in no uncertain terms, that I had already escalated the matter beyond their reach. The complaints were in the hands of the city now, and if they didn't back off, they would be facing legal consequences far beyond a petty neighborhood dispute. I watched the realization settle in his eyes. He knew they had overstepped. Knew that they had pushed too far, too fast, without considering that someone like me wouldn't back down. He left without another word, and for the first time since this battle had started, I felt the tide shifting in my favor. But just as I started thinking I had them cornered, they made their next move, one that made it clear they weren't just playing games anymore. When I checked my mail that evening, nestled between my usual bills and letters, was a court summons. The HOA had officially filed a lawsuit against me. The lawsuit wasn't a surprise, but the sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. They had thrown everything they could at me, claiming I was a public nuisance, that my property was in violation of multiple zoning laws, and that my refusal to comply with the HOA's requests had caused distress and disorder within the community. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to intimidate me, but it also meant they were willing to take this fight to the next level. That was fine by me. I had been prepared for this from the moment they tried to tow my vehicles. They had been playing checkers while I had been setting up my chessboard, and now it was time to make my move. I wasted no time assembling my defense. My lawyer, a no-nonsense woman who had dealt with more HOA disputes than she cared to count, barely glanced at their claims before shaking her head and calling it what it was, an absolute joke. Every single accusation they had made was flimsy at best, easily debunked with the records and legal documentation I had already gathered. My deed, property lines, county zoning laws, and even the security footage of their continued harassment were airtight. The HOA was banking on the idea that I wouldn't have the resources to fight back, that I would see the legal fees and the court process as too much of a hassle. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. Word of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood faster than I expected. The same people who had kept their heads down, afraid of challenging the HOA, suddenly started reaching out to me. Quiet conversations in the grocery store, a nod of solidarity from a neighbor I barely knew, hushed admissions of how they had also been bullied, fined, and harassed over the years. The HOA had ruled over this neighborhood unchecked for too long, and now that someone was standing up to them, people were starting to see just how fragile their authority really was. What started as small murmurs turned into something bigger, a full-blown pushback from homeowners who had been too afraid to speak up until now. The final nail in the HOA's coffin came a week before the court date. A long-forgotten document surfaced, one that they had hoped would stay buried. A former board member, someone who had resigned years ago, reached out to me with a copy of an internal agreement from when the HOA was first established. It confirmed, in no uncertain terms, that my property had never been part of their jurisdiction. Not only that, but it also contained a clause stating that any attempt to falsely enforce HOA rules on non-member properties could be considered legal harassment. It was a smoking gun, one they had never expected anyone to find. By the time we walked into that courtroom, the HOA's confidence had crumbled. Their lawyer, who had walked in with an air of self-importance, quickly lost that smugness as my attorney laid out the facts. She systematically dismantled their case, piece by piece, presenting the property records, the zoning laws, the security footage, and finally, the internal agreement that exposed their overreach in black and white. The judge barely needed time to deliberate before dismissing their claims entirely, but he didn't stop there. He turned his attention to the HOA board members sitting stiffly at their table and addressed them directly, warning that their actions bordered on outright legal fraud and that my counterclaim for harassment would be a very real problem for them if I chose to pursue it. The HOA president, the same man who had tried to lecture me in that hearing, sat stone-faced, realizing just how badly they had lost. I could feel the shift in the room, the quiet murmur of neighbors who had come to watch, the weight of something irreversible settling over the board members. This wasn't just a loss. This was humiliation. When I stepped outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, freer. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now approached me with words of thanks, relief written all over their faces. They knew, as well as I did, that this was more than just my victory. It was the beginning of something bigger. The HOA had lost its grip, and the neighborhood had woken up. But I knew it wasn't over yet. People like them didn't just disappear quietly. There was still one last thing left to do. The fallout was immediate. The once untouchable HOA, a group that had ruled over the neighborhood with iron-fisted arrogance, was now scrambling to maintain control. The lawsuit's failure was a public embarrassment, and while they had lost in court, the real loss was in the community's trust. Neighbors who had once followed their rules out of fear began openly questioning their authority. Some started digging into past fines, finding inconsistencies and outright fabricated violations that had siphoned money from homeowners for years. The HOA board, once smug and untouchable, suddenly found themselves under scrutiny like never before. The pressure was mounting, and cracks were beginning to show. It didn't take long for resignations to start rolling in. First, the treasurer stepped down, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth. He didn't want to be around when the financial records were audited. Then, 2 more board members followed, their carefully worded statements filled with empty excuses. The president, the one who had spearheaded the attack against me, held on the longest. But when whispers of a community-led effort to remove him from power started gaining traction, he saw the writing on the wall. One evening, a formal resignation letter appeared in the neighborhood's email bulletin. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a quiet retreat from the very organization he had once lorded over. But I wasn't done yet. Winning the legal battle was one thing, but ensuring this never happened again was another. I attended the next neighborhood meeting, the first one without the old regime in power, and watched as the remaining board members fumbled to regain some sense of authority. They talked about rebuilding trust, about moving forward, but the people weren't interested in empty promises. They wanted accountability. Homeowners started demanding a full financial review, questioning where their fees had gone, why certain expenses had been hidden. The pressure became too much. Within a month, the HOA was forced to bring in an independent auditor, and when the results came back, the damage was undeniable. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into unexplained expenses, fines had been misused, and funds meant for neighborhood upkeep had somehow vanished. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The final blow came when a petition circulated to dissolve the HOA entirely. People who had once defended its existence were now the ones signing their names, their trust in the system shattered beyond repair. The vote came quickly, and the result was overwhelming. The HOA was officially disbanded, its power stripped away, its influence erased. The neighborhood would now govern itself, free from the petty control and endless bureaucracy that had plagued it for years. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over the land they had once tried to claim as their own, I felt the weight of it all finally lift. What had started as a simple battle over parking had turned into something much bigger, a fight for autonomy, for fairness, for the right to live without being controlled by people who thrived on authority. I had won, but more importantly, so had everyone else. There would be no more arbitrary fines, no more harassment, no more threats disguised as regulations. The neighborhood was finally free. And as for me? I parked my truck in the driveway, stretched my legs, and admired the space that was undeniably, unquestionably, mine. No more letters, no more tow trucks, no more HOA knocking at my door. Just peace. Finally, peace.